The powder keg of Europe. In the summer of 1914, Europe stood at the peak of its power. Grand empires stretched across continents, industrial cities rose with smoke and steel, and scientific progress promised a brighter future. Yet beneath this surface of prosperity, deep fractures were spreading. Nationalism surged, empires decayed, and alliances bound nations in a web of mutual obligation. The continent was a powder keg, and it only needed a spark. That spark came on June 28th, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip, a young Bosnian Serb nationalist. What followed was not immediate war, but a chain reaction of ultimatums, mobilizations, and declarations. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia and declared war. Russia, allied with Serbia, began to mobilize. Germany, bound to Austria by treaty, declared war on Russia and then on France. When German troops marched through neutral Belgium to attack France, Britain entered the war. In just over a month, the entire continent was engulfed. The great powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria, formed the Central Powers. Opposing them were the Allies, France, Britain, Russia, and later Italy, Japan, and the United States. This was no longer a regional conflict. It was the first truly global war. Armies of millions marched to battle with rifles, artillery, and outdated tactics. No one imagined how long it would last or how deeply it would scar the world. Leaders believed the war would be over by Christmas. They were tragically wrong. The Great War had begun, and it would redefine civilization forever. The illusion of a quick victory. At the outbreak of war, both sides believed victory would come swiftly. Germany, following the Schlieffen Plan, aimed to defeat France in 6 weeks before turning east to face Russia. The plan required rapid movement through Belgium, but it quickly unraveled. Belgian resistance slowed the advance, and British forces arrived to support France. At the First Battle of the Marne in September 1914, French and British troops halted the German advance just miles from Paris. The failure of the Schlieffen Plan shattered hopes of a quick German victory. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Russia mobilized faster than expected and invaded East Prussia. Though Germany eventually defeated the Russians at Tannenberg, the two-front war became a reality. As both sides dug in, the war of movement turned into a war of trenches. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, a vast network of trenches stretched across northern France and Belgium. Soldiers lived in mud, rats, and constant fear. Machine guns, barbed wire, and heavy artillery made frontal assaults deadly. The Western Front became a stalemate, with neither side able to gain significant ground. Millions died for advances of a few miles. The Eastern Front remained more fluid, but the human cost was equally devastating. Empires crumbled under the strain. The war was no longer about quick glory. It had become a brutal contest of endurance. Nations poured their resources into the war machine, mobilizing entire societies. Civilians worked in factories, women took on new roles, and propaganda fueled national hatred. The illusion of a short war had vanished. What remained was a grim reality: total war. The machinery of destruction. World War I introduced warfare on an industrial scale. For the first time, technology became the dominant force on the battlefield. Factories churned out shells, rifles, and ammunition at unprecedented rates. Railways transported troops and supplies to the front lines. The war was no longer fought by small professional armies, but by millions of conscripted soldiers equipped with modern weapons. Artillery barrages could last for days, reducing landscapes to craters. Machine guns mowed down waves of infantry. Poison gas, first used by Germany in 1915, brought a new horror. Chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas caused blindness, suffocation, and agonizing death. Soldiers wore gas masks, but the psychological terror remained. Tanks, introduced by the British in 1916, were slow and unreliable, but hinted at future warfare. Aircraft evolved from reconnaissance tools to fighters and bombers. Naval power also played a crucial role. The British Royal Navy blockaded Germany, cutting off food and supplies. Germany responded with unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking merchant ships without warning. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, which killed 128 Americans, turned global opinion against Germany. The war at sea became a deadly game of cat and mouse. Submarines, dreadnoughts, and mines shaped naval strategy. On land, the scale of destruction was unimaginable. Battles like Verdun and the Somme saw over 1 million casualties combined. Soldiers endured shell shock, trench foot, and constant bombardment. The war was not just fought with weapons, but with willpower. Nations believed that if they could endure longer than their enemies, victory would come. But as 1915 ended, the war showed no sign of conclusion. The machinery of destruction continued to grind. The global reach of the war. Though centered in Europe, the Great War was truly global. Fighting spread to Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and the Pacific. German colonies in Africa and China were attacked by Allied forces. In East Africa, German commander Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck led a guerrilla campaign against British, Belgian, and Portuguese troops, tying down Allied resources until the war's end. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, threatening British interests in Egypt and India. The Allies launched the disastrous Gallipoli campaign in 1915, attempting to force a passage through the Dardanelles and capture Constantinople. After months of brutal fighting, they withdrew with heavy losses. Meanwhile, Arab tribes, encouraged by British officer T.E. Lawrence, revolted against Ottoman rule. Their guerrilla warfare helped the British advance through Palestine and Syria. In Asia, Japan seized German territories in China and the Pacific. German naval raiders attacked Allied shipping worldwide. The war at sea extended to every ocean. Convoys, mines, and submarines turned the Atlantic into a battleground. Neutral nations were drawn in. The United States, initially neutral, grew closer to the Allies through trade and cultural ties. When Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917, sinking American ships, the U.S. declared war. Brazil and other Latin American countries also joined the Allies. Even China contributed laborers to the Western Front. The war reshaped global power. European dominance was challenged. Empires weakened. New players emerged. The conflict was no longer just about European rivalries. It was a struggle for the future of the world order. And as the war dragged on, the human and economic toll mounted. Life and suffering in the trenches. Life in the trenches was a nightmare. Soldiers lived underground in narrow, muddy ditches, exposed to rain, cold, and disease. The stench of rotting food, human waste, and corpses filled the air. Rats and lice were constant companions. Soldiers stood for hours in waterlogged boots, leading to trench foot, a painful condition that could result in amputation. Sleep was nearly impossible. Artillery barrages never ceased. The constant noise caused shell shock, what we now call PTSD. Men broke down, screamed, or retreated into silence. Medical care was limited. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. Amputations were common. Infections spread quickly. Despite the horror, soldiers developed routines. They wrote letters home, played cards, and shared stories. Humor became a shield against despair. Behind the lines, supply units, engineers, and medical staff worked tirelessly. Women served as nurses, often near the front, risking their lives. Back home, families endured anxiety and loss. Governments censored news, showing only heroic images. But the truth was different. Entire battalions were wiped out in single attacks. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the British lost 20,000 men on the first day. At Verdun, French and German forces fought for 10 months with no decisive result. The war became a test of national will. Governments used propaganda to maintain morale. Posters showed brave soldiers and evil enemies. Songs, films, and newspapers glorified sacrifice. But as casualties mounted, doubt grew. Why were men dying for a few yards of land? The war had lost its meaning for many, yet it continued. Soldiers obeyed orders. Nations demanded sacrifice. The trenches were not just military lines. They were symbols of a civilization tearing itself apart. The collapse of empires. By 1917, the strain of war began to shatter empires. Russia, already weakened by internal unrest, collapsed under the pressure. Soldiers mutinied. Workers struck. In March 1917, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. A provisional government took power but continued the war, leading to more discontent. In November, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized control in the October Revolution. They promised peace, land, and bread. In 1918, they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, withdrawing Russia from the war. The Russian Empire disintegrated into civil war. Austria-Hungary, a multi-ethnic empire, faced rising nationalist movements. Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, and South Slavs demanded independence. The army weakened as soldiers deserted. The Ottoman Empire, once powerful, was in decline. Defeats in the Middle East and the Arab Revolt weakened its hold. The Armenian Genocide, in which over 1 million Armenians were killed or deported, marked one of the war's darkest crimes. The empire's collapse was inevitable. Germany, though still fighting, faced hunger and unrest at home. The British blockade caused severe food shortages. Strikes and protests grew. The Kaiser's authority weakened. In 1918, as defeat loomed, Germany sought an armistice. The Hohenzollern, Habsburg, Romanov, and Ottoman dynasties, all pillars of the old world, were swept away. New nations emerged from the ruins: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Finland, and the Baltic states. The map of Europe was redrawn. The war did not just change borders. It destroyed the very idea of empire. A new world was being born, but it would be unstable and full of unresolved tensions. America enters the stage. For 3 years, the United States remained neutral. President Woodrow Wilson urged peace and mediation. But American banks and industries were deeply tied to the Allies. When Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917, sinking American ships, public opinion shifted. The Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico against the U.S., provoked outrage. In April 1917, Congress declared war. American troops, known as doughboys, began arriving in France in 1918. They were fresh, well-equipped, and full of morale. Their arrival marked a turning point. The Allies had been exhausted. German forces, though strong, were stretched thin. The spring offensive of 1918 brought Germany close to victory, but it failed to break the Allied lines. With American reinforcements, the Allies launched the 100 Days Offensive. They pushed German forces back across France. American troops fought in key battles like Saint-Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne. Their presence boosted Allied confidence. The war was no longer a stalemate. Germany was losing. At home, morale collapsed. Sailors mutinied at Kiel. Workers and soldiers formed councils. The Kaiser abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. On November 11, 1918, Germany signed an armistice. The guns fell silent after 4 years of war. Over 16 million people had died. Millions more were wounded. Cities lay in ruins. Economies were shattered. Wilson arrived in Europe with his 14 points, a vision for peace based on democracy, self-determination, and a League of Nations. But the world was too broken for idealism. The war had changed everything. America had emerged as a global power. The age of European dominance was ending. The cost of victory. Victory came at a terrible price. France lost a generation of young men. Every village had its war memorial. Britain mourned its fallen. Germany faced humiliation and collapse. The human cost was staggering. Over 9 million soldiers died. 7 million were permanently disabled. Civilian deaths from famine, disease, and bombing added millions more. The Spanish flu pandemic, which began in 1918, killed more people than the war itself, spreading through troop movements and crowded cities. Economies were ruined, nations owed massive debts, inflation soared, factories that produced weapons now faced unemployment. The social fabric had changed. Women had taken on roles in factories, offices, and farms. They demanded rights, including the vote. In Britain and Germany, women gained suffrage after the war. Class divisions weakened. Soldiers returned with new ideas, often disillusioned. The old order, kings, emperors, aristocrats, was gone. In its place came republics, revolutions, and uncertainty. The war had destroyed not just lives, but faith in progress, reason, and civilization. Writers like Erich Maria Remarque and poets like Wilfred Owen captured the horror and futility. Art and music turned darker. The war had exposed the fragility of peace. Leaders met in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference to shape the new world. But their decisions would sow the seeds of future conflict. The Treaty of Versailles placed full blame on Germany, demanded massive reparations, and stripped it of territory and military power. Many Germans felt betrayed. The stage was set for revenge. The peace that failed. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919 aimed to build a lasting peace. President Wilson championed the League of Nations, a global body to prevent future wars. But the treaty imposed harsh terms on Germany. The War Guilt Clause blamed Germany for the war. Reparations were set at 132 billion gold marks. Germany lost Alsace-Lorraine to France, its colonies, and territory to Poland. Its army was limited to 100,000 men. The treaty humiliated Germany and fueled resentment. Austria-Hungary was dismantled. New nations like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were created, but ethnic tensions remained. The Ottoman Empire was partitioned. Britain and France took control of the Middle East under mandates, ignoring promises of Arab independence. The League of Nations was formed, but the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the treaty, so America never joined. Without American power, the League lacked authority. Japan demanded racial equality, but was ignored. Colonized peoples who fought for the Allies expected freedom, but received only broken promises. The peace was not just, but punitive. It satisfied victors, but not justice. In Germany, the Weimar Republic struggled with inflation, political violence, and extremism. Communists and fascists clashed in the streets. The seeds of Nazism were planted. In Italy, nationalists felt betrayed by small gains. Benito Mussolini rose to power. In Russia, the civil war continued. The world was not at peace. It was in chaos. The Great War had ended, but its consequences had just begun. The legacy of a lost generation. The Great War left a permanent scar on human history. It shattered empires, redrew maps, and killed millions. It introduced industrial warfare, total mobilization, and genocide. It destroyed the belief that progress was inevitable. The term "lost generation" described those who came of age during the war. Writers, artists, soldiers, who could not reconcile the horror they had seen with the world they knew. The war changed everything: politics, society, culture, and technology. Aviation, medicine, and communications advanced rapidly, but so did weapons of mass destruction. The League of Nations failed to prevent the next war. The unresolved anger, economic instability, and territorial disputes led directly to World War II. Hitler rose on the promise to overturn Versailles. The peace of 1919 did not last. Yet the war also inspired hope. The idea of international cooperation, human rights, and self-determination endured. Women's rights advanced. New nations were born. The world became more interconnected. The Great War was not just a conflict. It was a turning point. It marked the end of one era and the violent birth of another. A century later, we remember the fallen, study the causes, and ask, could it have been prevented? The answer remains uncertain. But the lesson is clear. Peace must be built on justice, not vengeance. and the cost of war is always paid in human lives.